let's start, Drupal, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your life in science and whether there was a turning point in your career where you felt that the scientific theories that you were taught and teaching people about were perhaps providing the answers that you were looking for.
Well, I started off being very interested in biology. My father was a pharmacist and a herbalist. And as a child, I was very interested in plants and animals, which is why I really wanted to do biology. And I was so keen on doing biology as a career that in my gap year, before I went to Cambridge, I wrote round various research labs in London to see if I could get a job as a temporary lab technician, which I did. And the job I got was in Hounslow at the factory of Park Davis, a drug company. And I then found that I'd ended up as the most junior technician in a vivisection facility. It was my job every day to gas the animals that had survived the vivisection. And this was the most emotionally wrenching experience for me because on the one hand, I loved animals, that's why I wanted to do biology. On the other hand, this was scientific research, and when I said to my colleagues what's going on, they said, well, you don't want to test new drugs on people, do you? You know, this is all very necessary. But I suddenly realized that biology was really, as we now know it, mainly about killing things. And when I went to Cambridge, I noticed almost everything we studied, we killed first. And so this is what first made me think something's gone horribly wrong, but I didn't know what it was. And it was only when I was an undergraduate I discovered the writings of Goethe, the German poet and scientist, which portrayed the idea of a more holistic kind of science. So I started thinking that things could be different in science. At that stage, I was an atheist. I'd been converted to atheism as part of my scientific education. And so I believed all the kind of atheist propaganda at that time. But my doubts were not about atheism, they were about science itself. And so I then did history and philosophy of science at Harvard to try and step back to see the bigger picture before going to Cambridge to do a PhD. I worked on plants because I didn't want to spend my career killing animals. And then gradually became more convinced that this mechanistic, materialist worldview was much too limited, and started looking for wider ways of thinking. And I came up with the idea of morphic resonance when I was working in Cambridge. And that, for me, opened a whole new possibility in science. And it also began to open up the possibility of spirituality being meaningful rather than meaningless, which I believed before.
That was quite a transition, personally speaking, I imagine, to go from atheism to actually having a very deep curiosity to learn more about spiritual practices. Was there anything else that contributed to that, do you think?
Well, yes. I mean, for me, a major thing that contributed was in 1968. I had a research grant from the Royal Society to study rainforest ferns at the University of Malaya. So I wanted to spend time in tropical rainforests. And on my way to Malaya, I stopped off for a few days in India, but I was so fascinated by India, I ended up spending 2 or 3 months there, and then a month in Sri Lanka. So I was very late arriving in the botany department in University of Malaya, but it didn't really matter because the ferns went on behaving much the same way the plants I was studying. And so when I was in India, I discovered this whole completely different cultural view where almost everybody took spiritual practices and spirituality for granted, rather than Cambridge, where it was as seen at best as a kind of fringe minority hobby. So that was a huge thing for me. And then when I got back to Cambridge, I encountered LSD, and that had a tremendously mind-opening effect for me. I mean, it made me aware that consciousness was much more than I'd learned about in my physiology lectures, about nerve impulses and neurotransmitters. And that then led me to an interest in meditation, exploring the mind through just meditation. I took up transcendental meditation. And I later got a job in India in 1974. And when I went there, I was primarily interested in meditation and yoga. And I was following various Hindu gurus. It was only in India that I returned to a Christian path. I was confirmed at the age of 34 in the Church of South India. So this wasn't something I expected when I went to India. It was the last thing I expected was to become a Christian while I was there. I then discovered a wonderful teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, a Roman Catholic Benedictine, who had a small ashram in South India, where I lived for a couple of years altogether. After working in India in the Agricultural Research Institute, I wanted time off to write a book on morphic resonance, my first book, A New Science of Life. And Father Bede invited me to go and write it in this ashram. So I lived wearing Indian clothes in a palm-thatched hut on the bank of the sacred Cauvery River, in this simple Benedictine ashram community. It was one of the happiest times of my life. It was quite wonderful.
So a scientist, a philosopher, and perhaps a hippie?
Well, when I was in India in 1968, that was peak hippie in 1968, and India was full of hippies, and it was really fun hanging out with them.
And I believe you met your lovely wife whilst you were in India, which may have had a...
That was a bit later. I did. Trin and I met in India. We met in Bombay. But that was after my book, A New Science of Life, had come out in 1981. We met in 1982 in Bombay at a conference called Ancient Wisdom and Modern Science. And Jill was giving a talk on ancient wisdom. I was giving a talk on modern science. That then led 3 years later to us getting married right here in Hampstead Parish Church.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the spiritual colliding with the scientific, as I mentioned, I work in medicine, and many might think that physical or medical approaches to health are diametrically opposed, really, to spirituality. And when I was at medical school, we did a whole module on evidence-based medicine. It's so deeply ingrained in medical people that you need this reproducible, rigorously tested evidence for a theory to be accepted. But I think GPs, perhaps more than any other specialty, recognize that it's very difficult to separate physical health from mental and spiritual health. Why do you think there's often so much skepticism or resistance to looking at health holistically, in a more sort of, I suppose, open way to considering the other determinants of health?
I think it's because the modern scientific world is still in the grip of this orthodoxy of mechanistic materialism. And the mechanistic materialist belief system or worldview says that we live in a purposeless universe. There's no consciousness out there. There's no God. There's just inanimate matter moving in accordance with physical laws. And that consciousness only exists in the universe inside brains. That means, as far as we know, just on this planet, in this vast universe. And just inside brains, primarily human brains. And some materialists would say, well, dogs and cats may have a bit, and liberal materialists would say maybe worms have a little bit. And so that's the materialist worldview. And it says we live in a purposeless universe. When you die, it all goes blank. And there's no afterlife. There's no God out there. God's just an idea in human minds. Therefore, patterns of activity in human brains. So that worldview is seen as the scientific worldview. And medical people want to be seen as scientific. So insofar as they're part of this worldview, and insofar as they're in that general framework of thinking, I mean, medical people have always wanted to be seen as the real thing as opposed to quacks. And the shadow side of medicine are quacks. And and there have always been quacks of various kinds. So in order to prove they're not quacks, then it all has to be evidence-based medicine. But the interesting thing is, there have now been thousands of studies on the effects of spiritual practices, thousands of studies published in peer-reviewed journals. I don't know if you know the Handbook of Religion and Health is about that thick. It's in 2 volumes, so about that thick in 2 volumes, with thousands of pages. It weighs a lot and costs a lot. But in it, there are reviews of thousands of peer-reviewed studies on the effects of religious and scientific practices on health. And what they show, basically, is that people who have religious and scientific practices are healthier, happier, and live longer than those that don't.
Is anybody else in the audience medical? I feel like I should have invited all my GP colleagues. We've got one. I mean, it's completely without doubt that people who are part of a religion, doesn't matter which religion, do better and need us less. So if you're thinking about choosing a religion, go for it. So I really enjoyed your book because it introduced me to lots of interesting practices that some of which I hadn't heard about before, some of which I take for granted, but which, when you look at more closely, can actually, it helps you to understand why they are healthful. So if I list them, this is the book, we've got some copies at the back. They include sections on gratitude, rituals, chanting and singing either on your own or collectively, connecting with nature and plants, and pilgrimage. And it would be nice if we could spend some time getting your thoughts on those. Which would you talk about first?
Well, I think the simplest is gratitude, because gratitude is part of every religious tradition. And it's also just part of ordinary good manners, saying thank you, please, and thank you. I mean, children are taught to do this. So it's something very, very basic. And in the realm of psychology, academic psychology, for many years, psychologists concentrated on what made people miserable. But it's relatively recently that the school of positive psychology has kind of grown up, which investigates what makes people happy. And one of the things that makes people happy is being grateful. One of the findings they've had is that if you look at people, grateful people tend to be happier than people who take everything for granted and feel entitled. And they're also more popular. Well, you don't necessarily need millions of dollars spent on a scientific study to prove that. Most people are aware of it anyway, that people who are entitled and just take everything for granted are definitely less fun to be with. So they actually did, being scientists wanting scientific evidence and evidence-based gratitude, they did studies where one exercise where they divided a class into a group of 3. One group was asked to write a list of all the things that had made them unhappy in the previous week, the hassles and problems. Another group wrote just a short story based on something that happened in the previous week. And the third group wrote a list of things for which they felt grateful in the previous week, good things that had happened and things for which they felt grateful. And the group that had made this list of good things that had happened to them were measurably happier for days afterwards. I mean, this very simple exercise of counting their blessings had this effect. And then they did another exercise where they asked people to write what they called the gratitude letter, to write a letter thanking someone in their life who they'd never properly thanked, who'd made a big difference. Could be a relative, a godparent, a teacher, but somebody who'd really influenced them, to whom they felt grateful. They wrote the letter, and then they went to that person, if they were still alive, and read it to them. And this had an effect on people that lasted for weeks. Just being grateful, acknowledging, had a huge effect. And then other studies showed people to make a regular practice every day of counting their blessings, thinking of what they're thankful for. are happier and healthier than those that don't. So this is an incredibly simple practice, and I myself do it every evening. I pray before I go to bed. I say the Lord's Prayer and the Hail Mary, and then I go through things in the day that I feel grateful for, and I find it a really helpful practice, and then I go on with my other prayers. But I think one very simple thing that anyone can do is give thanks before meals, and it's a very traditional thing to say grace before meals in all cultures. It's not just Christian. And when I was at Cambridge, the Cambridge colleges have the tradition of the beginning of dinner, formal hall every day. A gong goes and someone reads out a long Latin grace. And I was a scholar of my college, so I had to do this when I was an undergraduate. And this is just something that's taken for granted in formal, old-fashioned institutions. And it used to be done in lots of families, and we do it in our family. Either we hold hands silently for a while before meals, or someone says a grace, usually me, usually a very simple grace, or when our sons are at home and when we have more people, we sing a grace. And it makes such a difference. You know, at the beginning of a meal, there's usually a kind of gap. If you go out to dinner, there's a kind of gap. Everyone waits sort of expectantly and nothing happens. And then someone says, oh, do start, it'll get cold. Or possibly bon appetit as a kind of secular alternative to a grace. But the grace I like at present, which I usually say, is thanks be to God for all the blessings on our lives, for this food and for our time together. And I think that covers most things, and it's very simple. It doesn't take long. And I find it makes a real difference that the meal is blessed, we're blessed being there together. It costs nothing. It's incredibly simple to do. And so I think a lot of spiritual practices are really simple, really straightforward, traditional, and beneficial.
I mean, I agree. It sounds so simple and so lovely, and it does make that nice segue between everyone sitting down and actually starting. I mean, it certainly doesn't happen in my house. I can assure you that with 3 teenage boys who just wolf it, who can't keep them from their fruit. But does anyone in the audience ever say grace, or even inwardly say grace? You do. And another one over there. Perhaps more of us should. It feels very sort of old-fashioned, but I think it's a lovely thing. I mean, I think the gratitude diaries has become much more mainstream as an approach to managing depression and low mood. So it's definitely a modern concept as well, but we could all introduce it in our lives.
And when I'm on my own, I just say it silently. But I do think I think it makes a real difference. And actually, when our boys were teenagers, it was possible to get them to hold hands silently for a while before a meal.
Oh, lovely boys. My son, Claire, we didn't start doing that. So one of the nice things about the book, actually, is that Rupert, at the end of every chapter, he gives a couple of suggestions for how you could simply introduce it into your life, whether you're religious or not. How about thinking about our relationship with the natural world?
Well, I mean, personally for me, it's a very important part of my life, whether I call it spiritual or not. As I said, since I was a child, I've always been interested in animals and plants, and I love being in the natural world. And living in Hampstead, going almost daily onto the heath.
Do you mind talking us through, I was really fascinated in your book about how culturally the relationship with nature and God and our understanding their interconnectedness has changed through the millennia, and how...
Oh, well, I could give a very quick summary. I mean, I'm not going to speak about all other cultures. I'll just speak about our own, basically. But standing back, if you look around the world, in almost all cultures, it's taken for granted that nature is alive, that animals and plants are alive, and that we live in a living world. We're immersed in what we now call the ecology of a living world. And in shamanic hunter-gatherer cultures, shamans relate the whole culture to the natural world. They're like the interface between the people and the natural world. And hunter-gatherers, of course, have to know about plants in order to gather them and know when they're fruiting, and they have to know about animals in order to hunt them. So their lives are very closely linked. And then the same in agriculture. With the growth of farming and settled agriculture, people who herded animals like sheep or cultivated crops, you have to know about plants and animals to do that. And so there's a very intimate relationship with plants and animals, and most religions relate to that. In India, they have sacred animals, sacred cows, sacred elephants, even sacred rats, sacred trees. They're everywhere. And here in Britain, there was the idea that the whole of nature is blessed. In the Middle Ages, the official philosophy in the universities and in the monasteries was essentially a form of Christian animism. The leading philosopher was St. Thomas Aquinas, and he worked on the basis of Aristotle's philosophy that all of nature is alive. Animals are beings with souls. That's why they're called animals. Anima is the Latin for soul. The earth is a living being, Mother Earth. The whole of nature is alive, and God is within nature, and nature's within God, is what's now called panentheism. So God was in the whole natural world, in humans as well, and nature is a reflection of the divine mind and divine creativity. Our minds were part of the divine mind or derived from it, and because they both came from God, our minds could relate to and understand and empathize with and be part of nature. So that was the view, and that's the world view out of which our great Gothic cathedrals came. And you still see this sense of living nature in the foliage and the carvings of animals and plants. And then the Protestant Reformation led to a very big break with that, because Protestants were against all sorts of Roman Catholic practices like pilgrimage. Pilgrimage was outlawed in England in 1538 by Thomas Cromwell's injunction against pilgrimage. The shrines were destroyed in the cathedrals and churches. The monasteries were dissolved, which were the infrastructure for pilgrimage. And nature was marginalized. It was no longer seen as the presence of God in nature. Religion became much more about humans and their relationship to God, and the rest of the world was not particularly relevant to that. If anything, it was a hindrance. And then soon after the Protestant Reformation came the scientific revolution in the 17th century. And the key point of that was that the scientific revolution said nature is not alive. It was revolutionary precisely because it denied the life of nature. Animals and plants don't have souls. They're just machines. And human bodies are just machines. And God is not in nature. God's outside nature. God created nature like an engineer creates a machine. He designed the laws of nature, designed the whole of nature, pressed a start button, and then it all went on automatically. And God was supernatural outside nature. And so then religion was about relating to the supernatural, God and angels and spirits, whereas the whole of nature was not spiritual at all. It was purely mechanical, and science could then just get on with its study, ignoring or neglecting or just even dismissing the spiritual realm, or having it in a separate compartment. So you could go to church and you could pray to God, where it was about morality and stuff, but nature is just there to be exploited scientifically. Then, of course, that led to the Enlightenment and Enlightenment rationalism. It's all about economic growth through science and progress, which is still the dominant ideology of almost every government in the world. And then there was the Romantic backlash against that, which was all about getting back to nature, like Wordsworth and poetry and being in nature. And I think what we've inherited is a kind of emulsion of mechanistic materialism and romanticism. So during working hours in our secular society, the mechanistic theory of nature is the dominant one in schools, in education, in science, in business, in industry, in government. But then at weekends, millions of people try to get back to nature in a car. And, people, I first realized this when I was staying with a a friend who'd made a fortune in a, I'm sorry to say, a rather exploitative way, just exploiting nature, exploiting the world, because all he was interested in was money. But once he got his country estate, which is why he wanted the money, where he got there, he turned it organic, he preserved the oak trees, he reinstated hedgerows, and so on, because that was his weekend romantic self. Then he flew in his helicopter back to London on Monday morning to start his exploitative self. And so that was an extreme case, but I think all of us have got caught in that world where nature is something you do in the evenings and at weekends, and have possibly through gardening and through keeping pets like dogs and cats relate to the natural world in a more limited, private way. But there's a sense in which God was withdrawn from nature in the 17th century, and that means that a lot of people today I meet who think of church and God as just being about Sunday and about morality and sin and so on. And they really get spiritually refreshed by nature, but they see that as having nothing whatever to do with God. They see that as being nature. People say nature's my church or something like that. Mm-hmm. Personally, I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and I much prefer the view that you find in India and many other parts of the world, and indeed in medieval Europe, of seeing God in nature and nature in God.
So going back to the science, or the science side of spirituality, is there some evidence that relating to nature can produce beneficial effects?
Oh yes, there's tons of evidence. I mean, there's the Japanese have this practice called forest bathing, and where people spend time in woods and things, and are demonstrably better off as a result. And there's been research in the West too, showing that people who spend time in green spaces, walking in forests, spending time in the natural environment, have lower blood pressure, lower indications of stress.
I think you mentioned you can't really get the same effect from walking through an urban area.
No.
Which many of you may have observed today if you walked instead of got the tube. For anyone who's not in London, there's a tube strike at the moment. And I walked from Hampstead to Kilburn High Road, and I'd say it was the opposite of relaxing. But being closer to nature can be different.
Well, that's what this research showed, because they compared walking in green spaces with just walking in urban environments, so they could distinguish between the effects of walking and the environment. And so I think there's a great deal of evidence now that green spaces, being outdoors, and also relating to plants and animals, there's a lot of evidence that people who keep dogs and cats are healthier and less emotionally stressed than those that don't. And of course, gardening is well known for its relaxing effects on people. So I think that as a spiritual practice, a lot of people don't think of it as a spiritual practice, but actually it is. And where it links up with an obvious spiritual practice is in pilgrimage, which is one of our other themes.
It is, and it's an interest that you and I share, because you introduced me to pilgrimage, and it's having something of a rebirth recently in, let's say, the last few decades. Talk to us about pilgrimage.
Well, pilgrimage is found in all religious traditions. Muslims go to Mecca, they go to the shrines of Sufi saints. Hindus go to the source of the Ganges, to Mount Kailash, to temples, to all sorts of holy places. Buddhists go to the birthplace of the Buddha and so on. And Christians have many places of pilgrimage. And of course, Jerusalem's one of them. But in medieval Europe, there were pilgrimage routes crisscrossing the whole of Europe. There still are in Roman Catholic countries. But in Protestant countries, all these great pilgrimages we had, here in England, for example, as I said, were suppressed. Millions of people went on pilgrimages. I suppose most people must have taken part in a pilgrimage at one time or another. Canterbury was the most important one, the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket. Our Lady of Walsingham in Norfolk, the Black Madonna of Walsingham, was another very important shrine. The Holy blood in Hales Abbey, Glastonbury. There were many places, St. Ethelburga's shrine in Ely. There were many places of pilgrimage. And when it was suppressed at the Reformation, I think it left a void in the British soul. People missed it terribly, and that's, I think, why the British invented tourism, because tourism was a form of secularized pilgrimage. The tourists still go to sacred places, but they can't light a candle or say a prayer because they have to pretend they're primarily interested in art history. But I think tourism would be so much more satisfying if, when people go to temples and cathedrals and so on, they actually do treat them as holy places, which is what they are, is why they're going there. So I think that the revival of pilgrimage, which in Europe started with Santiago de Compostela in the 1980s, groups of artists and poets, French and Spanish artists, restarted this ancient pilgrimage. It had never completely died out, but it had gone down to a mere trickle. And in 1987, 1,000 people did it. Last year, 500,000 did it, walking to Santiago. And so this revival of pilgrimage in Santiago has had spin-off effects all over Europe, including in Britain, where 10 years ago the British Pilgrimage Trust started reopening the ancient footpath pilgrimage routes and developing new ones. And now the website britishpilgrimage.org has hundreds of routes now. And some of them are guided pilgrimages, some you could do on your own. Some of them have all the routes on mobile phones, so you can. I personally don't use a mobile phone, so I use paper maps, but you could do it either way. And again, as evidence of pilgrimage having beneficial effects is there too, because you get on the one hand the benefit of walking. All our routes, as far as possible, go through natural places. They're on footpaths as opposed to roads. And then there's a sense of doing something with the destination and a purposeful activity, which is one of the principles of occupational therapy. And pilgrimage, it sort of just does that automatically. And so this revival of pilgrimage is proving a really important and significant part of a spiritual revival, because many people who do it are not religious, or wouldn't describe themselves as religious, but they feel drawn to do it. And when they do, they find themselves reconnecting with holy places and with tradition in a way that they find surprising and also helpful. And the British Pilgrimage Trust is now organizing special pilgrimages for people who are bereaved or who have mental problems. And a lot of people have found that going in a group on a pilgrimage is really, really helpful.
And silent pilgrimages they have?
Silent or talking. Some of them involve silent bits and then talking bits. And so I think that pilgrimage would actually be a really useful thing for social prescribing. You know, in the Middle Ages, people went to their confessors to tell them what they thought was wrong with their life. And some confessors would then say, well, what you need is to go on this pilgrimage, and they'd prescribe a pilgrimage. But people go to psychiatrists or GPs. I suppose some of it is they taking on the role of confessors. And if they could prescribe pilgrimages, I think it would be really helpful for a lot of people.
I don't have a problem with that. I can prescribe pilgrimage. It's a lot cheaper than...
Yes, it wouldn't cost the NHS and everything. Yes. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely echo the amount of joy that can be had from a pilgrimage. And you could argue what's the difference between going on a pilgrimage and just going for a lovely walk in the countryside. And as you said, often it's just a bit more fun because you're going somewhere special, and so you get to see something very interesting at the end. But for me, I've never felt the importance of needing God to be in a special place. I think that's my Presbyterian background. But I really love the thought that so many people have walked that path for centuries, and so many other people have found this a special and important place. And actually, the joy is the journey itself, and what you may learn about yourself and others on the route. Quick poll, hands up if you've seen the BBC's pilgrimage series. Oh, not very many. Well, you've got that joy waiting for you. It is truly wonderful, and you will cry. And they have a group of about 8 from all different religions, and they're all there for different reasons, personal reasons, things they want to give thanks for, things they want to recover from, or they just want to take a break from whatever is going on in their lives. And it's really wonderful, and it sort of is a whole better version of reality TV. I commend it to you all.
Yes, it's brilliant. And they've done it. They did it 4 or 5 years ago, and it was so popular, they repeat it every year with different people on different pilgrimage routes. This year is in Wales, I think.
Yeah, really, one through the Alps. I think the latest one is through the Alps. Just stunning. Yeah.
One thing, could I just mention, Jessica, that not everyone here will know that one of the things the British Pilgrimage Trust is trying to do is start children's pilgrimages with school groups going on pilgrimages. And the pioneering children's pilgrimages have started right here. Jessica and I have been leading them for the last 3 years with children from Hampstead.
Mostly grown-up children, I have to say.
Well, they have to be able to walk. This year's St Albans one was about 4.5 miles, so they have to be. There's no use taking toddlers. So.
No, that's true. It was great.
Anyway, I've certainly enjoyed them, and as far as I can tell, the children did too.
And you can get a pilgrim passport, can't you?
Yes.
You can stamp all the different cathedrals that you visit. Yeah. So, I wonder if at this point we could perhaps invite any questions or comments about what you'd like to hear more about. Oh, Father Yunan's got a microphone. Fabulous. There's one here. So I think the question is, do you think Jesus' teachings speak about how you can experience Christianity in other forms? Is that the and less conventional, building place and orthodoxy, I suppose?
Well, I think that the history of Christianity shows that Jesus' teachings have been taken in all kinds of directions. I mean, there's Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches, all sorts of Protestant churches. I mean, there are many, many people who call themselves Christians who have completely different paths. Some are hermits, some are in extreme Pentecostalist churches, all think they're following Jesus. So it's quite clear that you can be a Christian, at least in your own mind, in all sorts of ways, including people who don't go to church, who are spiritual but not religious, and still followers of Jesus. So there's this tremendously wide spectrum. I personally find tradition very helpful. I love church buildings. I love the music. I love the liturgy. And my own theory of morphic resonance is a theory of habit in nature. There's a kind of collective memory. And I think when we take part in a ritual, a religious ritual, or any ritual really, but the ones that move me most are religious rituals, Christian ones, then you're tuning into all those who've done it before, and you're connecting with that whole tradition. And one reason I and lots of other people like choral evensong, for example, is because it's done in the 17th, 16th century language. It's been done the same way for centuries. The music is wonderfully beautiful and meditative. It's in holy places, in a calm atmosphere. I find all of these things we can have through organized religion and through churches. And some people are perfectly happy just meeting in people's houses and singing songs they've just made up. But for me, it's the ritual and traditional aspect and the liturgical year is really important. The rhythm of the year and the tradition and the morphic resonance, the kind of collective memory that goes into this, I find enormously helpful.
In fact, may I just say, when I don't think it answers your question about what Jesus taught, but when it comes to your teenage daughters, I think perhaps the first step is, as Rupert experienced when he opened his mind to the idea that there is more than just the mechanical and the materialistic. And I think, I don't know about you, but as a doctor, I use work as a coping strategy. If I'm feeling stressed, I just work more and that's fine until it's not fine. And I think many people will use all sorts of strategies, whether it's partying or other substances or just socializing and staying really busy, and then they discover that they're still not fulfilled, and then they find that there's that gap, and that's where spirituality is the first point, and then potentially, organized religion, if that's for them, can fill that need in all of us. But I've got some...
Can I just add one point about teenagers? Because I had a teenage godson, and I was trying to think what to do with him, because I stopped giving stuff to people. I just give experiences. And so when he was 14, I said to him, would you like to come? My offer to you for your birthday is we go on a pilgrimage together. We take the train to a village near Canterbury. We walk 4 or 5 miles through fields, meadows, orchards, woods. We go to a holy well. We light candles at the shrine. We have a cream tea. We go to choral evensong and then come home on a high-speed train. Would you like to do that? And he jumped at it. I didn't know if he'd say no or yes. And every year, all through his teenage years, we went to a different cathedral on pilgrimage. And I think taking children on pilgrimages, particularly teenagers, is very effective. Other people have done this too. And it's particularly effective for godparents. The country is full of underemployed godparents. And this is a really effective way of doing something with your godchildren. Of course, you can't do it until they're old enough to walk a distance. But I think pilgrimage...
There you go, you're Gandalf. You were Gandalf to your teenager bit. As we were asking about Jesus, and we've got an actual clergyman here.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the pilgrimage. You mentioned about teenager. I don't know whether you heard about Taizé in France, because I was a volunteer in Taizé. And every year we welcome like 8,000 just teenager young people. And it also really created that kind of atmosphere, like they know people, they make friendship, they feel they are not alone. But I have my question from your talk. Really thank you for your insight. And then, because I was anthropology and also did theology, a lot of theology and philosophy before coming to here. And I'm quite interested about how would you define spirituality in your sense? Or do you think there's a kind of scientific definition of spirituality? Or whether there's a scientific definition of Christian spirituality? I hope I don't talk too much. Challenging question.
Well, there isn't exactly a scientific definition of spirituality in terms of existing mechanistic science, because it says that there's no such thing as consciousness, basically, except in brains, and it's just a functioning brain. So it's not in a very good position to enlighten us about spirituality. The conventional scientific view would be there are practices people do that affect bits of their brain and maybe reduce hormonal levels in the blood, which have practices that they find helpful. But it would all be kind of physiological or psychological. But when we move beyond that very narrow belief system and we look at what's happening in spiritual practices, I think that all of them are about connecting with something greater than ourselves. They're all about becoming mystical experiences, are about feeling that our mind or consciousness is part of a vastly greater mind or consciousness, whether we call it God or not. Ritual practices are connecting with those who've gone before and right back to the founding of the ritual. It's again something more than ourselves. We're doing it with other people, and we're doing it in a tradition. In the Christian phrase, the communion of saints, that we're part of something much larger than ourselves. And I think pilgrimage, we're part of something larger than ourselves. We're going to a holy place where people in the past have found a connection with God or with the world of the spirit. and we're connecting with that and with the pathway they followed to get there. In gratitude, we're recognizing that we're part of a flow. When we say thank you for something, when we express gratitude, we're acknowledging that we've received something, it's come to us, and that by giving something back, if it's only just saying thank you, we're part of a flow. I think of it as the flow of the Holy Spirit. Whereas if we don't say thank you, we receive something, it just stops with us, and we're not part of a flow anymore. So I think all of these spiritual practices are about either being part of a flow, connecting with something greater than ourselves. And I think the specific feature of Christian spirituality is that we connect with the Spirit of Christ. I mean, all religions have a sense of God or some higher consciousness. But the specific feature of Christianity, by definition, is the connection with the Spirit of Christ. And that, to me, is many things, but one of them is an example of a human being who can be entirely filled with divine being. And so a kind of merging of the human and the divine. And you don't get the same thing in other religions. In Islam, for example, there's a very strong sense of God and God's presence. And Muslims, in many ways, are much better at relating God's presence to everyday life. You know, they pray several times a day, much more than most Christians do. They're very aware that everything depends from moment to moment on God's grace. So that's why they always say, Inshallah, God willing. But they don't have this sense that a human can be filled with the divine. Muhammad is a prophet. He's not a divine being. And so each religion has its own way of seeing things, but that I think is the most specific and obviously almost definitional characteristic of Christianity. Well, Christian mystics, when I was growing up, I was brought up in a Christian family and I went to an Anglican boarding school. I never heard a word about Christian mystics. I just didn't know there were such things. But when I was in Father Bede's ashram, he introduced me to the Christian mystical tradition, and for me this was a big sense of discovery, that I was aware of Hindu mystics, and I was aware of Sufi mystics, and I was aware of Buddhist mystics, but I wasn't aware of Christian mystics, because it's not, at least in the form of Christianity in which I was brought up, it wasn't a big feature of it. My own teacher, Father Bede Griffiths, was a very, I would say, a Christian mystic, a recent Christian mystic. And of his books, the one that I think is most helpful is called The Marriage of East and West, where he talks about the Western and the Eastern mystical traditions and their similarities and differences. His book, Return to the Center, short meditative pieces on a kind of mystical approach to life, and particularly a Christian mystical approach. And so I find him one of the most helpful. Of Christian writers in general, I find Thomas Aquinas one of the most helpful too, because he has the most comprehensive philosophy infused with a kind of mystical sense. Meister Eckhart is the one I find most powerful of the medieval mystics, and he writes in a clear, kind of punchy style. So yes, I think Christian mystical tradition's enormously important, and I think one of the things about Protestantism was that it tried to extend the mystical tradition to everybody, saying you don't have to live in a monastery or be a monk or be a hermit or a nun to be a properly spiritual Christian. Everyone should be able to do this in everyday life. It was a very high ideal, but the trouble is it can easily get degraded until it's not really mystical at all. It's all just about practical everyday life. And so there's always been a Protestant mystical tradition, but I think it's much stronger in the Catholic and the Orthodox worlds to this day because of their monastic tradition and the fact they still have hermits and monks and nuns and contemplating orders.
I don't know if you can hear me, but if you're interested in the Christian mystics, you can take the question. Our very own Hampstead Christian mystic, Evelyn Underhill, is buried in the additional burial ground over the road. So you can visit her grave anytime.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that very well.
I think that, Father Ilan, can I borrow the microphone?
Sorry about this sound fail. I think the question is about the paradox that is it the Sufi religion? Or which one?
Yeah, so if he was...
In Sufi mysticism, that God is in nature, but also that nature can't receive God? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, like nature cannot be God because like something limited cannot perceive the infinite.
Oh, something limited cannot perceive the infinite?
Oh, well, I think that's probably true in all traditions. I mean, we're limited. You could say that Christ received the infinite in the Christian tradition, but he was still limited in living in a particular time and place in a human body of normal size. Yes, I'd have to look at the exact text that relates to say, but the Sufi mystics obviously have a very high level of mystical sense of divine presence, divine love, and so on. And I'm not sure to what extent in Islam this extends to nature. Obviously, everything in nature can only receive God to the degree it's capable of receiving God. And St. Thomas Aquinas thought that plants were reached their highest state by achieving the most perfect form they could. You know, a beautiful flower or beautiful tree or beautiful rose is actually coming into the divine presence by expressing their form, which is a God-given form. And by expressing it, they actually enter into the divine consciousness and enter as fully as they can into the divine presence. But each organism, each kind of being has its own limitations. Otherwise, if it had no limitations, it would be God. So everything in the world has to be limited.
I think this question relates to... This question relates to how art and beauty sits at... and creativity sits in relation to God and spirituality. Have I understood that? Yeah.
I think that in most traditions, and certainly the Christian one, God is the source of all creativity, directly or indirectly. In the creation accounts in the book of Genesis, God creates some things directly, let there be light, and there's light. He creates some things indirectly, let the earth bring forth vegetation, let the oceans bring forth animals. And so it's called mediate creation. It's sort of empowering nature to be creative. So there's creativity in humans, of course, as well. And in all traditional cultures, people think that the ultimate source of this tradition, is spiritual beings, ultimately God. But the Greeks thought that each of the arts had its own muse, a muse, but like in the Christian terminology, a bit more like an angel, I suppose. But we call music because it has its muse. And we call museums because they're like temples to the muses which inspired the human arts. So, and then the idea would be the ultimate creative inspiration for humans, particularly Christians, would be the Holy Spirit. At the beginning of Milton's Paradise Lost, like in classical terms, they invoked the muse. He invokes the Holy Spirit. And, this is again very traditional. When you go to a concert in South India of South Indian music, it starts with a song invoking the blessings of the goddess Saraswati, who's the goddess of music. So the idea is that all this creativity comes through us. It's we're channels of creativity that comes from a spiritual level beyond us. And of course, in a secular world, there's no beyond for it to come from, so it just originates inside our brains. You know, in the Greek and Romans thought that each person had a spirit that guided them, their genius. Genius means spirit. And so for a Greek and Roman, if Einstein was thought to be a very brilliant scientist, they would say Einstein had a genius. But in our modern secular world, they say Einstein was a genius, and this creativity must have come from within his own brain, which is why Einstein's brain is in a laboratory somewhere in a jar of formalin, where people have been trying to find out which bits of the brain are the bit that gives the genius. So I think that the idea of creativity having a divine source and coming through us, and art as an expression of the creativity that can come through us, just as the beauty of nature is an expression of the creativity that comes through nature, art is an expression of the creativity that comes through us. And I think the interesting thing about this exhibition called Investment is about vestments, religious vestments, where art is applied for a spiritual end. Of course, for many modern artists who are atheists, who don't believe in God or a spiritual realm, then the art is all about them, or all about people, or all about mundane things. It can't possibly be inspired if there's nothing that can inspire it. So it's literally uninspired. Doesn't mean to say it's all bad, but inspired art means the spirit breathes in through it. And that means the artist has to be open, consciously or unconsciously, to the creative breath or power of the spirit working through them. And if they're not, then the spirit won't be working through them, it will just be themselves that's doing the creating.
I think it's a wonderful question, and I'm sure people will have their views, but I'm going to believe that our artist Graziana has been a conduit for God's beauty. She's sitting at the back there, I need to be. Finally, I did say I was going to ask you this week, but you've had a little bit of preparation time. Of the spiritual practices that you've talked about, which do you feel has had the greatest impact on your life? It's like a desert island disc for spiritual practices. Which one are you going to keep in your island?
I think prayer. For me, prayer is the most central practice, really, which I do every day. It's not in that book. There's a sequel to that book with 7 more spiritual practices, ways to go beyond and why they work. So there's a chapter on prayer in the second volume. But for me, that's something that can happen at a particular time. It can happen all through the day. And it's a way of relating prayer. All prayers start with an invocation to a spiritual being. Our Father who art in heaven. Come Holy Ghost, our souls inspire. Hail Mary, full of grace. All prayers start with, we connect with the spiritual being by invoking them, and then relate that spiritual presence to our daily life. I'm talking about ordinary intercessory prayer here. And I think this prayer is the way that I find most helpful in relating the spiritual realm to the actual practical realm in which I'm living, to myself and to other people and the world around us.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And as I mentioned at the start, for anyone who would like to give prayer a try in a different or new style, there will be a short service of Compton, a few minutes after we finish. So I'd like to say thank you once again, first of all, to Graziana for the beauty that she has surrounded us with this evening, and of course to Rupert for sharing his insights and personal thoughts on how we can improve all our spiritual lives on a daily basis. So will you join me in thanking him?